Hello, everyone. Today we're going to read the story Equality's Call. The story of voting rights in America. It's written by Deborah Diesen and illustrated by Magdalena Mora. So many people have fought so long and so hard to make sure we all have the right to vote, and they're still fighting today. In 1776, the founders of the United States of America declared that the consent of the governed would be a key component of our country. That means that everybody has to agree who's governing us. The founders didn't always agree on everything, but they did believe that the power of our government should come from the will of the people and that citizens would express their choices by voting in elections. But at that time, only some people were allowed to vote. Citizenship, the legal status of being a member of a country, and the right to vote, sometimes called the franchise, political franchise, or suffrage, were not available to all. As our nation grew, our understanding of democracy and rights grew too. Many people stood up and spoke about abolition, the end of enslavement, about citizenship, about enfranchisement, and about civil rights, equal opportunity for all. They worked to end voter suppression, which is the practice of preventing people from voting. They heard equality's call. Equality's Call, the story of voting rights in America. Our founders declared when our country began, the consent of the governed was part of the plan. Through voting, elections, and representation, the voice of the people would strengthen our nation. In fact, though, for years, this great founding ideal was extended to some and for others not real. But we heard in the distance equality's call. A right isn't a right until it's granted to all. The states set the rules about who got to vote, and your gender, your race, your wealth were of note. Could vote, could not vote. White men with property went to polls, but the rest of the people were left off the rolls. The dream of democracy wasn't yet true. There were changes to make, there was still work to do. The rolls is referring to the list of people who could vote was called the voting rolls, or it's still called that today. But we heard growing clearer equality's call. A right isn't a right until it's granted to all. American history. The rules about wealth were the first to go. As more were enfranchised, their voices could go. And a small group of voices was raising the fact that enslavement was wrong, an unspeakable act. Good people stood up for the truth that they knew. Abolition and suffrage were long overdue. Suffrage is the right to vote. We heard ever louder equality's call. A right isn't right till it's granted to all. There was war in our nation and slavery was ended. Amendments were added, the franchise extended. Vote here. Now more men could vote, at least so the law said, yet denial through taxes and tests was widespread. And the voices of women were mostly omitted. That means they were left out. And the voices of women were mostly omitted. In only some states was their voting permitted. But nothing could muffle equality's call. Give us the vote now. A right isn't right till it's granted to all. Suffragists didn't give up the fight, and the 19th Amendment gave women the right. But voters of color still met with oppression. Their voting was hindered by brutal suppression. 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act is passed. Before this act was passed, Native Americans were not considered citizens of the United States. 1964, the Civil Rights Act is passed, protecting the rights of Black people in the United States. 1965, the Selma to Montgomery March and the Voting Rights Act is passed, protecting the rights of Black people to vote. So we passed legislation, that means laws, to make voting fair, to extend and protect voters' rights everywhere. 1970 was the first extension of the Voting Rights Act. We demand equality now. Now, what will you do for women's suffrage? What will you do for the rights of women to vote? We heard it, we felt it, equality's call. A right isn't right till it's granted to all. The journey's not over, the work hasn't ended. Democracy's dream must be constantly tended. Our vote. But where we are now is a debt that we owe to the work of more people than we'll ever know. And each time we vote, we acknowledge the past, we honor our rights to ensure they will last. Voting is people power. For to vote is to answer equality's call, and each time we vote with them all. Voting is people power. Our vote, our voice. Equality now. We demand voting rights now. And I'm just going to read the author's note, which is about voting-related amendments and legislation. The U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1788, is our nation's framework and fundamental law. It's the highest law in our country. As it was originally written, it did not establish voting rights. It allowed states to determine who was eligible to vote. Since then, constitutional amendments, that means changes to the Constitution, and federal laws across the United States have been passed to extend citizenship and voting rights and to protect those rights from being violated. Some key amendments and laws include the 15th Amendment, ratified 1870, granted African American men the right to vote. After the Civil War, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to former slaves, and the 15th Amendment affirmed the right of African Americans to vote. Some states still enacted laws that created discriminatory barriers to voting, such as literacy tests and poll taxes, suppressing Black voting, especially in southern states. The 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, granted women the right to vote. Many Americans, including Native Americans and Asian Americans, were prevented from becoming citizens. Only women who were citizens gained the right to vote when the 19th Amendment went into effect, and only those with access to the votes were able to cast votes. In 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act was passed. It granted citizenship to Native Americans. Laws in some states continued to prevent Native Americans from voting, however. Native Americans did not gain voting rights in all states until 1957. The Chinese Exclusion Repeal Act in 1943 granted citizenship to some Chinese immigrants, and the Immigration and Nationality Act in 1952 ended Asian American citizenship restrictions. Prior to these acts, most Asian Americans had been prevented from becoming U.S. citizens by the Naturalization Act of 1790 and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Unable to become citizens, they were also unable to vote before this time. The 23rd Amendment, ratified in 1961, gave residents of Washington, D.C. the right to vote for president and vice president. The representation of citizens living in D.C. is different than that of citizens living in the 50 states. Prior to this amendment, D.C. residents were not able to vote in presidential elections. The 24th Amendment was ratified in 1964 and outlawed the poll tax in federal elections. Poll taxes were a fee that had to be paid prior to voting, so you had to pay in order to vote, and they restricted voting for the poor and were not fair. Poll taxes were levied in some states from the 1890s until the 1960s, and their purpose was to disenfranchise Black voters. The 24th Amendment abolished the poll tax. It means they got rid of the poll tax in federal elections. The Voting Rights Act in 1965 outlawed discriminatory voting rules such as literacy tests. It was an act to support and enforce the 15th Amendment, which granted African American men the right to vote. It prohibited barriers to voter registration and voting based on the color of your skin. It also provided for more oversight, more supervision of state and local voting practices. Since then, many states have enacted new barriers to voting, such as voter ID requirements and restrictions on voter registration. The 26th Amendment in 1971 lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. So today, the voting age is 18. In that same year, the Supreme Court ruled that the law was only valid for federal elections. The 26th Amendment guaranteed that the right to vote at 18 in all elections. Voting accessibility for the handicapped and elderly. In 1984, this act improved physical access to voting. This act required states to make sure that polling places were accessible. Accessibility requirements were furthered by Title II of the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act, which ensured that people with disabilities have the full and equal opportunity to vote. The National Voter Registration Act in 1993 required states to expand voter registration opportunities. Also known as the Motor Voter Act, this act made it easier for Americans to register to vote, including when obtaining or getting a driver's license. In 2002, they passed the Help America Vote Act, which made reforms to the election system. This act established state voting standards and provided funding into states from the government to improve their voting equipment. There's also a long list of voting rights activists. And it asks, how will you answer equality's call?